Today, we're joined by Ken Good, an attorney and one of the country's leading voices on bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system. But this conversation goes far beyond bail reform because the decisions we make about crime and criminal justice don't stay inside a courtroom. They affect public safety, our communities, our elections, the way we think about fairness and accountability, and ultimately the kind of country we want to live in. Ken has spent years working inside the system and studying what happens when policy decisions that may sound good in theory collide with the realities on the ground. So today we're talking about crime, politics, bail reform, public safety, and how all of it connects to the America we live in. And now to the episode.
We're here with our new friend, Ken Good. Ken, why don't you tell us what your thoughts are and your position on bail is, and we can get everybody into the topic.
My experience on criminal justice reform throughout the country, and especially in our urban areas, is really not reform, it's decriminalization. I think that's probably a pretty good summary of my thoughts on criminal justice reform, bail reform. And I think we're starting with time, we're uncovering that, and we're starting to roll back those reforms and become more public safety minded like we have historically. So I guess my position on criminal justice reform, bail reform is most of it is tested jargon with poll groups. And if you really look back at what criminal justice reform is really, it's really just the talking points of socialists. So we're going to get rid of jails, we're going to get rid of crime, and we really, to take care of people, we just need to feed them and house them, and that's really just socialism, and that's really a lot of the criminal justice reform, bail reform that we're hearing from in our urban areas. So it's not really bail reform, it's to move us towards socialism, and once socialists get in power, jails don't get smaller, they get bigger, but they start holding their political opponents.
Right.
So I guess one of the reasons why I was so excited really to have this conversation with you and excited for our listeners to hear this conversation, I'll just speak for myself. One of the reasons I really wanted to start the podcast is because I think that there's so much power in hearing from people that actually engage in the fields or with the issues that we all just talk about on social media all day. And I think that your line of work and your story is very humanizing to a subject that a lot of people have demonized the Republican, I guess you could say, viewpoint on.
I agree. I agree. I agree that this is a very weird topic. I've always said that, bail reform is really a low-hanging fruit for the activists. Nobody likes bondsmen, the private industry. If we had something we could replace them with, we would have done that years and years ago. We wouldn't have been around for 200 years. And so the reason why the private bail industry has been around so long is because that's the only tried and tested method for getting people to go to court. And it's still true to this day when you've got the private industry has less than a 10% failure to appear rate, and then everything else has 25%, 50%, 75%. And we've got some counties in Texas or a county in Texas that's like 83% failure to appear rate. You can see that those are not alternatives. They're experiments that are causing the criminal justice system to collapse. And so the way you prevent that is by dismissing cases, because I don't think the public really knows, a criminal case can't go forward without the defendant except in very limited situations. So if they fail to show up, their case is put on standby, hold until they come back, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, a couple of days, months, or even years. And, that can cause its own set of problems because that's what creates backlogs, because on average, we're adding the same number of cases to the criminal justice system every year. And if you don't get that same number resolved in the year, then you've got a backlog. And the backlogs usually will grow if you're not careful. And then it's really hard to get backlogs resolved.
Right. So I guess when I first heard from you or heard about you, I was introduced to the Lee Gilly case, and thank you for that because I love a new case. I'm an investigator on the side in my personal time.
Even though she doesn't play one on TV.
But So can you walk our listeners through the Lee Gilly case? I think this is a really good example of, like, the message you're trying to get out there and the work that you're trying to do, that these bail reform, criminal justice reform ideas, experiments don't work.
Sure, I think the Lee Gilly case, it's in Houston, Texas, so Harris County, so one of the largest counties in the country. Guy's arrested. He's accused of killing his girlfriend and, their unborn baby. Case has been pending for a while. He was required to wear a GPS monitor. And, a lot of jurisdictions would think a GPS monitor is, a panacea. It's a replacement for the bail industry. And it's not, and for a bunch of reasons. Number one, it's a lot more expensive. Than the private bail industry, because you're going to pay so much a day. And if your case goes on for 3 or 4 years, then it's going to be very expensive. And also there's a lot of other reasons why there's a lot of false positives. The battery ran down, or there's allegations that they left the jurisdiction. So, the county officials get very used to false positives on GPS. But what Mr. Gilly uncovered, because he was a smart person, is that if I wait till 5:30 on Friday to cut off my GPS monitor, I now have a head start until Monday to run. And so he took 8 months. Changed his physical appearance, grew out his hair, grew out a beard, and so he planned this thing for a long time, and he cut off his ankle monitor at 5:30, and then somehow got from Houston, Texas to Canada. And in the meantime, picked up a fake passport from a foreign country and flew from Canada to Italy, I think Turin, Italy. And when he was going through customs in Italy, they discovered that his passport was fake. And he immediately claimed asylum because he was arguing that the United States was trying to apply the death penalty on his case, which has turned out not to be true. They haven't asked for the death penalty. And so he knew very much what he was doing, and he's still there to this day. He's still in Italy fighting extradition, but I think his options are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I think the equivalent of the prosecutor or the DA in Italy has now recommended that the court grant the motion for extradition, sending back to the United States, and not prosecute him for illegally entering Italy. So we are at the end of this little escapade, and he will be coming back to Texas. And his trial was ready to go, so he waited till the very last minute when he ran.
Yeah, I guess if you use these systems, then somebody needs to be in place to actually get the alert. Because my understanding is that the alert that he took the monitor off came through. There was just nobody there to see the alert and send it to the appropriate channels of people. So these things don't work unless there's
Well,
somebody there.
I think that's true. I think one of the things the public does not realize is just when the GPS monitor gives off an alert, that doesn't issue a warrant. All that does is issue a notification to the GPS monitoring company, and then they send a notification, generally an email, to the court coordinator, the district attorney, whoever they're supposed to forward it to. But if they're gone for the weekend, which usually courts are, then nobody's going to see it till they come back on Monday, assuming Monday's a work day, and then they're going to have to work through their emails, and even then, nothing's going to happen. They're going to see an alert. Okay, they're going to triage it. Is this another fake alert, or looks like this is a real one? And then they're going to file a motion, and someone's going to present that to the trial court, and then the trial court's going to determine whether to issue a warrant. So this is something that's instantaneous. And, these systems that we've set up is what's, the bureaucracy, if you think about it that way, is what's slowing down the process. And so when people say, we can just do a GPS and we don't need anything else. No, we absolutely cannot use GPS as a replacement for the private industry. No.
So what would be different, Ken, in a bail scenario in that case? Had it not just been a GPS monitor, which is oftentimes part of bail, right?
Well, I think that when you're on a private surety bail, you're reporting to the bondsman. You're reporting weekly, biweekly, and the bonding company. I mean, the GPS monitor doesn't have the ability to report to the judge, "Hey, this person's back on drugs," or "This person's going to where they're not supposed to be." But the bonding company in Texas has the ability to go directly to the trial court judge and say, "Hey, we need a warrant, and here's why." And the judge has the ability to review that request and determine whether he's going to enter a warrant or not. And then the warrant would give the bonding company the tools that it needed to go and return the defendant to custody, and then the court could determine what's going on. And so, when the private industry is not involved and the trial court issues a warrant. So like in this situation, okay, so GPS monitor, he cuts it off on Monday or Tuesday, the court's notified, the court issues a warrant. Well, that warrant is going to go down to the warrants division at the sheriff's department with all of the other warrants waiting to be served, which is usually like in a county like Harris County, there's tens of thousands of warrants waiting to be served, which usually means you have to commit another crime. But if a warrant is issued and the private bail industry is one of their clients, then they're actively looking for the defendant. And so they can actually hire recovery agents to go and serve the warrant. And so I think that's a little bit better situation, and that helps return defendants in a much quicker basis.
Gotcha. So you're making the parallel that the private industry, the actual bail industry, resulted in a lot less skipping on bail, if you will, because
Yes.
there's an economic incentive really for the private bail company.
There's also family involvement. Usually, I think most people don't realize that the customers that come to the bonding company are usually family. And so, there's a big difference when, you are standing up for your brother and you're saying to your brother, "I still think you can turn this around," versus no family involvement. And, career criminals will get to the point where they've run through their entire family, all their friends, and so they don't have any of that family involvement. And those are the people that really need to stay in jail. Because they're career criminals. But I think, the financial incentive that you mentioned, but has an incentive to get people back within certain time periods because they get rewarded for that. But I think from the start, getting people to not have, there's a reason why there's a less than a 10% failure to appear rate on the private industry. They get family involved, and the families is the best pressure point against defendants to get them to act in an appropriate manner.
Can we talk about career criminals? Because I think we've talked about this a lot, and you see it in the news, especially where we live in New York City. It feels like in New York City and everywhere else, basically in this country at this point, you could commit a heinous crime and be home for dinner.
Yeah,
But
I think that's true, and especially in our urban areas, you're going to see that, especially like, New York passed bail reform, probably in 2020, somewhere around there, and they made this long list of crimes, and they say, "Oh, these are all nonviolent offenses." But they made this long list of crimes that said, if you're accused of this crime, then the judge has no discretion. You have to be released, and you have to be released on no bond. And, in Texas, that kind of sounds like you're not released, but it means you're released on your own recognizance, or in Texas, it'd be released on a personal bond. But it's just you're being released on your own promise to come back. And bail is what assurance are you going to give the court that you're going to come back? Well, under the
yeah,
those reforms, the assurance was my word, my Boy Scout's oath. And the problem was, we've discovered since COVID, is that that's not worth anything, and people don't come. And here's the problem: the kind of the basis of that thought is we're going to treat everybody the same. And for career criminals, when you have a long criminal record, we're not supposed to treat them the same as first-time offenders. But that's the whole thought of those reforms. We're going to treat everybody the same. So now, no matter how many times you've been accused of this crime, as long as it's on this list, you're going to get treated the same. You're going to get released without bond. And so career criminals, gangs, organized crime, they have figured out ways to make tons of money on those crimes that they can't hold them. And I think that's one of the reasons why New York has rolled back their bail reform 3 times now. And it's still the number one issue.
yeah, I'd agree with that. our governor right now she seems to be out to lunch a little bit, and that's being nice, but,
Well, but
um,
I think it's worse than that. It's all politics,
yeah.
because I think the Democrats know what they're doing. I mean, what I've heard from New York is before the reforms even passed, behind closed doors, the politicians were saying, we'll put up with more crime to get our political agenda. And that's really what's happened. But now you can see, especially from all the elections up in y'all's area, the activists are holding the sitting politicians hostage. You will do what we want. You'll agree with us, or we'll just elect a Democrat socialist. And I think that's going to last for a very short period of time. You could even argue it might be at the end of its cycle because in Wisconsin, the socialists lost. But what I would point out on these threats is, in the 3 elections that I'm thinking of, the polls were all saying that Democrat Socialist was up 10, 20, or even 30 points. And there were mainstream Democrat candidates that dropped out of the race because the polls said they had no chance of winning. And then when you get to election day, they either win by 1 point or they lose by 1 point. And, the most recent one, the Democrat candidate for governor in Wisconsin lost by a point, and she was beat by a Democrat candidate who had stopped his campaign 2 weeks before and then restarted it days before the election. And you look at these things and go, how can it all be on the same same candidates? The Democrat socialists are up 30 points suddenly, and then on election day they win or lose by a point. That's not possible. That's not a coincidence. That's not a quinky dink. That's really just, I would say, manipulation. I mean, you can't be off 30 points without just being either, I would say, intentionally misleading the public, or I would say intentionally misleading the public.
Well, there's no question that polls ever since really 2016, the presidential race of 2016, when the polls were calling it a Hillary Clinton landslide. Ever since then, any one of these polls has been either majorly manipulated or completely fabricated.
Well, but look at Trump. I mean, the support for Trump has always been undervalued in polls by at least 3 points, not 30 points, though. And we've got, an attorney general in Texas who's running for Senate, the U.S. Senate, and he's kind of like Trump. His support has always been undervalued by polls by about 3 points. But there's a big difference between 3 points and 30 points. I mean, can you imagine if me as a lawyer going somewhere and being that wrong by 30-something points on something? That's unheard of. I can't fathom. The point you just made was really good because, here we are with polls that were off by 5 points, and they were there was a scandal about how off they were. And then you've got now examples of 3 different races where the polls were off like 30 points. The Wisconsin governor's race, the poll or the primary, the Democrat Socialist, the poll said she would win by at least 17. She would win by no worse than 17. She lost by a point.
Right, which is completely in the other direction for a large number. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of different possibilities on that mathematically, but the same factor is, no matter how you slice it, is either it's you're taking a snapshot of the wrong group of people, right? Or you're not taking a snapshot or a hybrid of the real population, or whatever the numbers are, you just manipulated them.
Well, and that's a good point. I think so because most polls, they call people and they figure out what their preference is, but then they find out the makeup of the group they called, and then they alter their poll results by trying to predict what would be the makeup of the people that show up for election day. So for some reason, their polling overestimated the socialists that would show up on the primary election day by an astronomical amount. But the point I would make on that is once you start seeing that and realizing that's manipulation, well, then you look at these pseudo studies that say, oh, we should do this bail reform, this criminal justice reform, because it will not increase crime. And then you go, oh, you know what? I don't think I believe that. And then you start seeing, oh, well, you don't have to believe us. You can just believe that the FBI statistics, they show that crime isn't increasing. And then October of last year, suddenly the FBI statistics were updated and they showed crime was increasing. So suddenly they couldn't talk about that. So then it was, well, here's a study that says it's not increasing as a result of bail reform or criminal justice reform. And so then it's like, well, it's not our fault. I mean, it's like classic kid. Nuh-uh, it's not our fault. It must be somebody else's. We don't have any idea. But then you start going, okay, where else is all this happening? I mean, when the activists say, don't believe what you're seeing, believe us, there's a problem.
I mean, it's actually so counterintuitive because the idea that anybody believes it's going to be, and the pendulum has swung so far the other way, right? That I know if I commit a violent crime or a heinous crime, I'm not going to spend the night in jail. I don't have to wait to get bailed out. Even if I can't afford bail, it doesn't matter because there's no bail. So I'm going to be home in time to have cornflakes in the morning, and there's not anything anybody could do about it, which obviously in the opposite, if I think I'm going to go to jail and I think, well, gee, I can't afford bail, so maybe if I don't want to be in jail, I shouldn't actually commit the crime. That's, an incentive not to have a higher crime rate. How anybody believes it's the opposite is beyond me.
I agree. And the FBI just announced, I think yesterday or maybe Friday, but in the last couple of business days, they've announced record reductions in violent crime across the United States, which is very consistent with removing certain illegal criminals from the country. And that's very consistent with one of the things I've been saying, and that is that a large number of crime is committed by the same people every day. I mean, when you live like in New York, when you live in Chicago, it's probably a little higher in Chicago. But when you live in Houston, there's like 60% of the crime is committed by the same group of people. And, if we would address that 60, percent, or people who are committing 60% of the crime, we could have a major reduction in crime. I mean, we know how to reduce crime. It's just the activists are preventing us from doing that. And what they're really upset about is this isolation, which is what we call prisons. If you're not going to conform and become a productive citizen, then to protect public safety, the whole concept of a prison is we isolate you away from society so that we can have public safety. And somewhere in this debate, the activists have decided that they're going to take the side of the criminals over the victims. And, we've seen debates where, Gascon, who got his ass handed to him last November, he got 25% of the vote in the general election because he was trying to run for re-election. But he was one of the worst of soft on crime, and the public said, we've had enough of you. But his office released a press release one time saying, well, we just have a disagreement over who the real victim is in the criminal case. They're thinking that the victim is really the criminal defendant, not the person who had the crime committed on them. And think about that for a minute. If the prosecutor in the courtroom is saying that the criminal is the real victim, and the defense attorney is saying the criminal is the real victim, who's in the freaking courtroom arguing for the person who had the crime committed on them? Nobody.
Nobody. Yeah.
No one is. And what we lose in this whole debate is we still in the United States commit crime basically along our minorities or by our racial makeup. So, 50% of all murder victims in the United States are young black males. 50% of the people who are committing the crime are generally young black males. And so in this debate, we've decided to favor the young black male murderers over the young black male decedents, and that's ridiculous.
Right, it's like you're
His
racist if you point out a fact, but
Yeah,
you're
yes, and
if you point out
I've been on debates where they can't respond to me on the merits, so they'll just say, "Well, you're a racist." And I'm like, "Well, that's just all that is, identity politics. You're telling your supporters, stop listening to me because you're now dangling the little thing saying he's a racist, he's racist." And my response is that just means you can't come up with a response on the merits. I mean, if you can't respond to me, if you can't come up with an argument that counters what I'm saying, then you're just trying to cut off the debate and trying to end it instead of find a solution.
No, we see that a lot of across a lot of subsections of the political spectrum where there's really no debate because to debate it on the merits would wind them up looking somewhat ridiculous because the
Mhm.
concept is ridiculous. And the fact that anybody would politicize or sensationalize the murderer, or victimize the murderer over the person who's murdered. I mean, the whole idea of criminal justice is to bring the criminal to justice, right?
Yeah, but also the idea of criminal justice is we only apply that amount of pressure to get that person to change and become productive. This cookie cutter approach where we're going to treat everybody the same is intended to do the opposite. The amount of pressure I need versus the amount of pressure you need is two different things. And the amount of pressure that somebody has a 10-year criminal history is going to be a lot more severe than I am, or you are. And so the idea of the criminal justice system initially was to exert whatever kind of pressure was needed to get somebody to become productive. The problem that we have is the activists would say, well, that's racist. That's an evidence of systemic racism. And my reaction to that is hogwash. That's not true. I mean, that's the intention. If trying to get somebody to become productive, it means that you're racist, then you're giving up on society. You're giving up on a generation.
Yeah, I think I spoke to somebody once, and I think I told you this, Ken, but I don't think we ever spoke about it, but I was canvassing in the streets as I do, and, I was
Well,
speaking
somebody has to.
I was yeah. I was speaking to somebody who's I don't know exactly what they do now, but they said that they worked in, um, homelessness and in low-income areas, and that when they went to school, and were in college, they believed that the criminal justice system is racist and we go after Black men disproportionately, and he said, and then I came into their communities and realized that they actually want more police because they don't feel safe.
That's right. Well, I mean, that's what's lost in this debate is when you defund the police like AOC wants to do, or she has argued in the past. I think now she's saying that, oh, that's just her past. But when you defund the police, there's studies out there, and the studies show that crime goes up 75%. So, and where's it going to go up quicker? In our minority communities. If crime goes up, it's going to go up quicker in our minority communities. And suddenly it's racist to say we want public safety. No, that's not a racist comment. I mean, to want to feel safe in your community, that's not racist. That's not anything. That's, 5 years ago, um, that was a thought that everybody had. It's only in this bizarro upside down day versus night world of the activists where suddenly you're going to get attacked for saying something like, I want to feel safe. I want my daughter to be able to go out at night and not have to worry. I know as a father of two girls, I think you probably always will worry. And, we teach girls not to go out at night by themselves. But I don't know. I mean, that's the whole point. We want to have public
Well,
safety.
listen, I 100% agree with that. We live in New York City, and I grew up here in New York City. I mean, I'm a male, so it's a little bit different. And as a father, we always worry about, our daughters. I worry about my wife walking around New York City also. But I was 13 years old, 12 years old on the subway, running around Manhattan as a kid, going all over the place, 13 to 15
Wow.
at night, all hours. And it wasn't the best then either. I mean, talking a gajillion years ago at this point. But now, as compared to now, I wouldn't let any family member be out that late at night, let alone taking a subway, let alone,
Well, and you look at the
doing
girl from
any.
North Carolina that was killed on the subway just randomly, but, how many people could that happen to every day? I mean, there are people that are just trying to make a living, a single mother who's actually maybe she's trying to go to college. Maybe, maybe she's not a mother, but she's single and she's working at night and she gets off at night. She doesn't have a choice about taking, an Uber. She's trying to save money. And so, the subway is their choice. And so when we're decriminalizing these, petty crimes, which some of them are crimes from the subway, or when we decriminalize or when we dismiss cases because of an allegation of mental health, which was the problem in that situation, when we have now created the largest mental health facilities in the country is our prisons and our jails, well, then you don't have a capability of giving that kind of care outside of those institutions. And so when the activists come in and they know better, they're smarter than all of us. And so they come in and say, here's how you do it. When they say they have a mental illness, then you dismiss their case because we don't want them in the criminal justice system. Well, that creates a revolving door because their case is dismissed. They get out of jail. They get off their medications. They start having problems, and then they start acting out, and then they get arrested. They go back to jail. They get back on their medications because they're in jail, and then they're controllable. And it just is a cycle that just keeps repeating itself, and they keep dismissing their case until it's a very bad case. It's a violent offense. And then suddenly, before where they're dismissing their case, now they're going to keep it and try to put them in prison. And, isn't that the situation that happened in North Carolina? That guy's federal charge for murder, he's been found not competent to stand trial. Now they're trying to rehabilitate him. But, why do we have to wait until he committed a murder to address his mental health needs?
I think he had been to jail like 14 times.
He had been, and he'd been, but he'd had but a lot of those predated criminal justice reform, and
Mhm.
so he had spent some time in prison. But a lot of his cases were dismissed too because he had mental issues. And I've been on a panel where the mental health worker was there with me, and I was like, here's the problem. Mental health workers are not trained to triage whether what they're being told by the defendant is true or not. I mean, you have to take what they're telling you at face value and you have to believe it. And so, well, who learns how to manipulate that? Career criminals, gangs, organized crime. They come
Right.
in and they know, hey, if we say we've got a mental health issue, then the likelihood of them just dismissing our case goes up substantially. And they also know that the people listening to them have been trained to support them, trained to believe them. And so all they have to do is learn the right words, right buzzwords, and they're manipulating the criminal justice system and they're manipulating the activists. And so some of these, things that are being proposed are with a good intention, but they're doing more damage than they realize. And the big problem we have with the activists is they never will admit they're wrong. Never. I mean, you can go back and you can show them all this stuff that's not working and they won't admit it. No, we just need more time. We just need more money. And it's like, Portland was an absolute failure when you decriminalized heavy drugs and you were having record numbers of overdoses every month, more and more people dying. And so when it came back time to renew those experimental statutes, the public said no. Gosh, dog it. I mean, that's what we were saying would happen, and that's exactly what happened. But to the activists, like, oh, it's a big shock. We put all this money in training programs, and 0.01% of people took advantage of all the training programs. And so you start thinking, well, where'd all this money go? And so a lot of these reforms, you're starting to wonder, especially after all the NGO money, are we just lining somebody's pocket with it? Is it really not intended to reform? It's just pushing more money to social programs and politicians. I mean, you got to sour on it just for that reason.
Well,
Or be
listen,
confirmed.
where is compassionate is the next group of people, but the idea of criminal justice is to keep the violent criminal off the street, right? I mean, or out of the way of doing harm to innocent people. So, in your opinion, your professional career, obviously you've been doing this more than a half hour. Where do you think, where do we go from here? How do we get back to a criminal justice system across the nation that really works to protect the victim and to really justify doing something to the violent criminal?
I'm going to say we have to go back to what we know works. But we also have to look at our history of, these experiments that we have done that have been good. I mean, we have set up drug courts across the country. And, if you think about what a drug court is, it is when somebody goes there, we've got the hammer of the law, the hammer of the threat of prison to pressure them to go to rehab. Now, rehab has a 75% failure rate. So 75% of the time they go, they're not going to be successful. So you've got to keep that hammer on them to keep sending them back to rehab until it sticks. Well, criminal justice reform, bail reform has killed drug courts, mental health courts, all these specialty courts across the country because why do you need that when we're just going to dismiss the case? You don't need to go to
Right.
drug court if we're just going to not hold you responsible. And so that's really kind of the lesson that I think this criminal justice reform soft on crime approach is when you don't hold people accountable, then they will run with it and they'll see that as a green light to commit more crime. I mean, there's a great case called Sanchez versus Alabama where a sheriff had to live under one of these release everybody orders, and then it got reversed on appeal. And so when it came back, crime had gone up substantially. And he said, I talked to him. He said, look, we restored what we have always done. We told criminals, if you don't come to court, there's consequences. And if you don't do what we tell you to do, you'll be held accountable. What do you know? 6 months later, crime started going down. So we know how to get crime to go down. It's just the activists are pressuring the politicians to not do it.
Do you think there's a generational divide, though? Do you think that the younger generations are, focused on how everything feels?
I think we're being sold a bill of goods on that. I think we're being told that there's a generational divide, which explains why there's a 20 and 30% poll supporting the Democrat socialist candidates. But when you get to election day, that all evaporates and goes away, and they win or lose by a point after getting the mainstream candidates to stop campaigning for weeks at a time. So I think that we're being sold a bill of goods, that it's a generational gap. We all want to feel safe. I think there might be a bigger generational gap on how to operate the economy, but not on crime. I mean, not on crime. We all want to be safe. We all want our families to be safe. We all want our children to be safe. I don't think that's generational. No, I think that's a bill of goods. One of the lessons that we've learned from all of this over the last 5 years is how much of that is fabricated. When you have people protesting, how much of that is real? How much is that spontaneous? And how much of that is bought and paid for? And I think that the scary part is I don't think we realize how much of that's been bought and paid for. And that's scary to me, that we have groups out there that have rent a mob, rent a protester. I mean, 7 years ago, I think if you would have made the allegation that somebody had rented a mob or rented a group of protesters, I don't think people would believe that. And now you've got people going on news organizations saying that is their company. That's what they do. And they pay people quite a bit of money per hour to do that. And then, I find it interesting that a lot of that disappeared when the NGO money dried up. And so I'm like, how many of those groups were we funding out of our own taxpayers' money? And that's really a scandal all by itself, is how could you ever let the activists be back in charge of the country with the way they were funding NGOs? And, and so like AOC is now saying, oh, we have a big tent and those really aren't my beliefs. That's just phase one. So you can trust me. I'm like, Joe Biden said he was a moderate and he's going to return us to normalcy. And then he got in office and he turned over running the country to the hard left, to the activists. So how could you believe any of them ever again? When they say when their actions say one thing and then their words say the opposite, I would say you really can't trust them. Now, I know there's a lot of people that don't like Trump and there's a lot of people that question his policies, but the one thing I think we all should be able to agree on about Trump is he pretty much does what he says. And so there's not really a question about, oh, he's lying about his policy. Whatever he says his policies are is what he's going to push.
Oh, there's no question about that. And push relentlessly, actually.
Well, yeah, and one of the policies he's pushed is getting rid of cashless bail. And so that's something that's happening in our urban areas, or the push is, and he's looked at it. It's not something that really helps him electorally other than on the crime issue in general, but it's something that most of those people in those areas are going to vote Democrat. And he's looked at it and said, no, this is bad, because it is. And so he's pushing it to try to improve the lives of our inner cities, which is significantly minorities, or there's significant numbers of minorities that will help. And I think, the thing that I think the Trump haters, the people with Trump derangement syndrome, I think those people just will never be able to agree to that Trump has good intentions. But I think he does. I think he's looked at that. And if you look at something and you go, wait, there's a failure to appear rate of less than 10% versus a failure to appear rate of 80%. I mean, we would never try the 80%. That's why the activists say, oh, those numbers can't be real. I mean, because they can't concede that.
Right. It's impossible for them to say that they're wrong or they got the analysis wrong.
Yeah, look, admit if they did, what would happen in our urban cities? If they were to admit the policies that they pushed increase crime, and were intended to increase crime, they would get punished by the voters. So they can't admit it. And that's the reason why we get these pseudo studies coming out saying, oh, these changes are not the reason why crime is going up now. I mean, or here's a study that says that they're working. No, they can't be working.
Well, we're proponents of bringing back the real criminal justice system. There is a big void because there really are no more, there really isn't a mental health apparatus in the United States.
It's moved into our criminal justice system and our prisons. And so when you add mental health to the housing problem, to homeless problem, and then you add drugs to that, I mean, I would argue, look, in our urban areas especially, the government has already failed on schools. The dropout rate is really high. They've already failed on families. Families don't stick together in our urban areas, especially in a lot of minority groups. They failed on economic opportunity. Look at the protests with George Floyd, or, maybe riots. All the fires that burned down businesses, and a lot of them were not built back. So they lost economic opportunity. But then we have those same politicians, those same government groups saying, well, we've screwed all those up, but this time we're going to fix it all by criminal justice bail reform. And I'm like, well, those are all examples of things you did not do. And if you were not able to do them, you're not going to be able to do this. And what you've done has made it worse. And I think you would, in a truthful debate, we would at least acknowledge that it's been worse. But they can't. They can't admit that, because then they would be punished at the next election.
Well, so the real truth of the matter is, the real truth is it's electing officials that's the problem.
Well, there was some, Harris County is a big Democrat area, but there were some campaign ads that ran before the last election, and all they did was highlight horrendous stories from the criminal justice system. And at the end, all they said was, vote Republican judges. And so no matter what else, vote Republican judges. Every race in Harris County that was, I believe every race that had a Republican and a Democrat running for judge, the Republican won. Even on family court, even on probate court, that's how effective those ads were. And so I think, that's how much I think the public wants safety. And, when we have these soft on crime DAs, when they get defeated, they're usually replaced by a law and order DA. So the soft on crime DAs have a 1-2 term shelf life and they're done. And so I think the Democrat socialists will have the same shelf life, if maybe even. I mean, they're already talking about a recall vote on the, is it Seattle mayor?
Yeah.
I wish they would do that here.
Well, it's early, but I think the difference was that I think that mayor was still living with her parents when she was 40 and getting, they were still paying for her living. The article I read even made a comparison to Mamdani, is that he's a lot more intelligent, or that's
Yes.
what their argument was. And he's a really good speaker. I think the Democrat socialists are following a cookie cutter campaign. They go out and recruit somebody that really speaks well, but who will do whatever they want them to do. And I think that's Mamdani's that way. I think AOC is that way. I think the guy that just got replaced in Maine was that way. And the other guy, I can't say Ed or whatever his name is. I think he's that way. People who are really able to stand up and speak well, but they're not for law and order. They're for socialism. And socialism is always, we're going to get rid of crime. We're going to get rid of prisons. We're not going to put anybody in jail. And that never works out when they get in power, because they have to put their political opponents in jail. So it's, but we're following that strategy. Oh, housing. Well, that's a socialist campaign plank. If we just provide food and housing to people, we wouldn't have crime. No, we already have programs to provide housing vouchers. We already have programs to provide food, and we have crime. So if, what are you going to do when somebody commits a murder? Are you going to give them a summer home on top of what you've given them already? I mean, we have poor people in the world that don't commit crime. So it seems more of a moral issue instead of a social issue.
Well, we thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.